I'm not sure why there's chimes chiming. Is that coming from X3 or? Yeah, but it's a weird time. Yeah, I thought it normally happened. Time is off, or maybe I'm off. Okay. All right. Well, I thought they normally did this at noon, but 11:10 is odd. Okay. So let's go back here to talk about the different theories and perspectives. Last time we talked about the 5-factor trait theory. This theory has a lot of agreement, a lot of research that has looked at this theory, a lot of support that, yeah, this is a pretty good way of describing variations in personality traits. And yeah, 5 big common traits. We can see that the research supports this across cultures. We can study consistencies and inconsistencies or changes across the lifespan, as there's a lot of research now. This theory is old enough that we've been able to follow people for 20, 30, 40 years. And we can see common changes across the lifespan in adulthood. What it does not do is it doesn't explain why you have the personality you have, how you got to be that way, and how you can change personality. It doesn't attempt to do that at all. It just says, here's a picture of personality. Snapshot right there. The other theories are where we have to turn to try to figure this out. The last time we talked about you're not born with personality, you're born with a temperament that interacts with your environment, particularly your social caregiving environment. And then somehow magically you reach adulthood and you have this personality thing, right? Like, so what happens between birth and adulthood that is forming and setting this personality? These other perspectives are going to try to take a look at that. So the first one we want to talk about is the biological perspectives, and there's 2 main theories that we're going to look at. In general, all the biological perspectives say that your personality comes from your genes. That's also where the biological perspective says my physical self comes from, right? My physical traits and characteristics are written in my DNA. But the biological perspective also recognizes that your genes interact with your environment and your experiences. So, I could be born with the genetic blueprint to be this tall, but I'm not. My blueprint says build a body this tall, but I haven't reached that potential. What could potentially explain why my height isn't quite as tall as it should be? Any ideas? Why someone might be shorter than their blueprint?
Lack of sleep.
Okay. We know that human growth hormone is secreted in sleep, so I could have had not just one bad night's sleep, right? But I could have had a lot of disrupted sleep throughout my growing period. Kaylee, what else can explain my shorter stature?
Just like, I don't know, I've heard like genetics, like you can study different traits.
So I could be doing something, my environment could be doing something that is stunting my growth, right? And so it could be intense physical stress from training for a sport, okay? What other things may cause me to be shorter than my blueprint says I could be? Well, the genetic condition would be in my blueprint, right? So my blueprint would be fixed. Why would I be less than my blueprint? Right, but the wrongness, if it's a genetic thing, it would be wrong in the blueprint. Does that make sense? So what else could manipulate my height? I got sleep, I got intense physical stress. What do I need to grow? I started out as this little bitty thing. What do I need?
Like you're like, maybe you don't have to ride like, good food sources as like a baby and stuff, and your bones.
So I could have periods of malnourishment, right? I could have a period of illness. I could have psychological stress. All of those things, sleep, diet, stressors, are all environmental or experiential factors. And so my physical self is not just my genes. Remember we talked about genotype and phenotype. My express traits, to include behavioral traits like personality, is a result of an interaction between my genes and my environment, just the way my height is an interaction between my genes and my environment. So all the biological perspectives share this basic idea. Now, Eysenk's particular perspective focuses on the structure of personality. And the big five is kind of a structure to your personality, right? So Eysenck would say, where does that structure come from? Why do we see traits like extroversion? And why do we see the variations in those traits that we see? Well, Eysenck says that those traits are hardwired into our DNA. Just like I have a blueprint for building height, right? Blueprint for building an ear. I have a blueprint for extroversion. And what that blueprint really is not extroversion as we would see it in an adult, but how conditionable I am based on environment that I'm in. Am I easily conditioned by paired associations through observational learning? Or easily conditioned by consequences of my action and responsive to change my behavior to seek out different future consequences? That's what Eysenck says is genetic, is this conditionability, how easily we are altered or responsive to environment. Does this make sense? So think about that elementary school classroom we talked about a little bit last week and all the different things that teachers did to try to manipulate kids' behavior, to try to use rewards and punishments and lucky bucks and green lights and red lights and cards and things like that. Did all the kids respond the same to those efforts? Or did some of them, it kind of just fell on deaf ears? The teacher's efforts seemed not to really influence some kids' behavior the same as others. Eysenck would say that's because they had differing inborn degrees of conditionability. And that's going to interact with this environment to produce the variations in personality that we see. Eysenck would also say that personality is based on a series of many, many specific responses to specific situations, which are influenced by my genetic degree of conditionability and the unique environment that I'm in that moment, that very specific moment. That leads to habits. Habits are related to that behavioral learning perspective we talked about with the previous unit. And that leads us to traits that together are part of a higher order trait. So that the gene part is how easily you are influenced by the environment. Now, a related theory, another biological perspective, is the evolutionary approach. And we talked about this approach just a little bit way back in the first chapter. You guys remember that way back in the chapter 1? We talked just for a little tiny bit about the evolutionary approach. Main theorist here is somebody named Buss. And what Buss says is that these patterns of behavior, these traits, or these degrees of conditionability, if you want to borrow a phrase from Eysenck, are there in our DNA because they were advantageous for our ancestors. They helped an ancestor survive and reproduce to pass on that genetic tendency. or conditionability, which is why we see the personalities that we see today. So you can see where agreeableness, the ability to get along with a group of people, could be advantageous to your ancestors. If I can get along with this group, we can share resources. I can hunt and you can gather. You can build shelter. You can care for the young ones. Like, we can all take on different roles within our society, and together we can all survive much better if we work together. So being agreeable was probably advantageous. Then the question may become, why do we see some people who aren't? Why are there variations in personality? Well, part of it goes back to those different roles that people played in early society. So there was a place for people who disagreed, who became leaders. And you think about somebody like Genghis Khan, right? Do you think Genghis Khan was an agreeable sort of fellow? Conquered most of the known world? I don't think he was agreeable. It was his way or the highway. And as part of his conquering behavior, he spread his sperm all over the place. And so he has lots of descendants because his disagreeableness and his, it's my way or the highway and I will kill you if you disagree with me, caused his genetic material to survive better than others. And so different circumstances, different traits are advantageous. Another kind of example of this is somewhat related to agreeableness, but it's more about empathy. The ability to care about somebody else's life experience. Do we all have the same degree of empathy? And you would think about social animals that do better when we work together. Empathy would be a valuable personality trait. Like, everybody should have at least a little bit of empathy if they were going to survive and reproduce. But if you look at somebody like Genghis Khan, probably he didn't have a lot of empathy because he killed a lot of people. So his empathy was probably pretty low. And so the question is, why do those people exist? Why do we have extreme low empathy people found throughout history? And about the same percentage throughout history? Well, one theory is that those low empathy people, while they're not good if it's just our group, they're really good if we're competing against a different group. And if we're competing against a different group for resources, and it's only one group gets to survive, I would like to take those low empathy folks and point them at my enemy. It's kill or be killed. So we need some people who can kill. We need some people who can make those tough choices and steal the resources from the other group so we can survive, and doesn't care so much if those people survive. And so the evolutionary approach says that we have these variations because different traits are advantageous within a group setting. And that's why we see some of the variations that we see today. So what evidence do we have for a biological genetic component? Well, we have a field of research called behavioral genetics. Most of what you learned about genetics in your biology classes was based on understanding physical characteristics. Things like blueprints for height, or eye color, or skin tone, or size of bones in my ankle, like all the different aspects of my physical self. That's what you know from studying genes. Behavioral genetics looks to see which genetic combinations are associated with behaviors. So it might be empathy, or it might be sense of humor, or it may be personality traits. So we can apply that same study of genetics to these patterns of behavior. One of our favorite types of studies is twin studies. We love twins in the world of genetics because there are two different types of twins. There are monozygotic identical twins that were created from a single egg and sperm who have roughly 100% of the same DNA. Now, there are teeny tiny variations that can happen because teeny tiny variations in environment, but for the most part, they are 100% clones. Their DNA is the same. We can compare those to dizygotic twins or fraternal twins that were formed from two different eggs fertilized by two different sperm. So their degree of genetic relatedness is about 50%. Like most siblings are about 50%. So if we compare those groups, it can start to help us tease this out. So if your personality was completely determined by your genes only, what would we expect to see in identical twins in terms of their personalities? They would be the exact same personality. Anybody know identical twins? Are they exactly the same? No. So, probably it's not all genes, but we can actually estimate what percent or what portion of personality seems to be most influenced by their genes. And that's where we have heritability estimates. So we can get an estimate of what proportion of that personality trait is determined by genes. And so these heritability figures here, a 1 would be 100% everything is genetic. So do you see any ones here? So we openness is pretty high. It's about 61% of your personality is that related to genes in terms of how open you are. Agreeableness, it's a little lower, it's about 41%. So if you kind of do the rough math across those 5 traits, about half of your personality is genes. What's the other half? Circumstances, environment, it's nature and nurture. About half can be accounted for by genes, and about half can be accounted by environment. So if we look at the results of one of those studies, we would see something like this. Identical twins are represented by the yellow bars. Fraternal non-identical twins by the reddish bars. And this is their degree of correlation on Big 5 traits. So we gave twins, sets of twins, Big 5 personality tests. And then we look to see how close are their scores on each of the Big 5 traits. So what you can see for all 5 traits is that the identical twins are more similar to one another in personality than the non-identical twins. Yay! There's probably some gene influence there because we're seeing this difference. So if we break the differences down, that's the difference between the identical twins and the non-identical twins. Both sets of twins were formed at the same time, lived in the same womb, exposed to the same things in the womb, born at the same time, and then after birth, they would have variations in life experiences, right? So what explains that big difference between these two sets of twins? Nature or nurture? Genes or environment? What is the green probably determined by? Why are the identical twins so much more similar to one another than the non-identical? The most likely explanation. Because they have much closer genes. So this strong genetic influence. Now, remember I said this would go all the way up to 0.1 if it were perfect. So we're going to take this out, past the chart there. What explains the difference? So both sets of twins are not at all alike at this portion of their personality. What best explains that portion of variance? Is it Monday morning? Squeeze your brains. Probably not genetics. So what do we think is going on here? Not nature, it's going to be nurture, right? So this is going to be environment, nurture. And then this portion here is difficult to completely tease out. We know it's a little bit of genes because there's still half of the shared genes between those fraternal twins. But it's also probably interacting a little bit with environment there. So why are you the way you are? Were you born this way or made this way? Yes, a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit of your genes, it's a little bit of environment, and those two things interact with one another. So biological perspectives have some strengths in understanding personality, because we can actually find evidence that we can use to draw some conclusions. We can do some scientific experiments and come up with some hard facts that we can look at. And those facts at this point are suggesting that, yeah, they're both important and they interact. Some drawbacks to the biological perspectives is the type of math that these numbers are based on are estimates. They're not hard numbers, they're kind of fuzzy numbers with error built into them. And so we can't say things with certainty and clarity. We can say, generally speaking, here's kind of the trend that we see, that it's kind of like this. But there's a lot of qualifiers in estimating. Because the biological perspective is so focused on genes, some people think they overemphasize the gene at the risk of underestimating the influence of environment. And they say even those identical twins, that part that we colored green, it's not all genes, but there's still environment going on there. Identical twins' environment is different than fraternal twins' environment. So think about how much more likely identical twins are to be dressed the same, to be enrolled in all the same activities. I have a niece and a nephew that are obviously not identical twins. Their parents did not dress them the same, and they ended up in different activities, partially because one was a boy and one was a girl, partially because they had different issues. They were born prematurely, they had some different health problems. And so my nephew has pretty severe asthma. And so he doesn't do anything very physical or taxing because his asthma is so severe. His sister is a singer. She sings, she competes, she tries out for Muni and all those kinds of things. He could never do that. His lungs would never let him do those things. And so he has very different life experiences, whereas identical twins would be more likely like you're both taking karate, you're both taking piano, you're both doing all these same things. And so we may be underestimating a little bit. The other thing is that the biological perspective doesn't really apply itself to understanding personality. That's too narrow. Biology is a much more broad perspective that's just trying to kind of understand everything. And personality is a part of our everything, but it's not all of who we are and what biologists would be interested in studying.